Okay, I think we have now over 100 attendees connected, so we're going to get it started. Welcome to our workshop on ISO 13485 certification. We're going to start with some housekeeping remarks. As for all the sessions that we are organized, this session is being recorded for its future availability at the Coalition's website. We already have all the presentations that our kind speakers are going to be sharing with us today available at our website. So we're going to be posting the address shortly in the chat box. We do have available, in this case, sorry, it is only simultaneous interpretation in English and Spanish. So you can choose your preferred language by clicking the icon with the globe that is located at the bottom of your screens on the Zoom platform. All your microphones are closed as to prevent background noise and make it a fluent event. So for that and to make it interactive, we kindly ask you to post your questions using the Q&A feature. There is also an icon at the bottom of your screens. And a reminder, a kind reminder to our speakers that we're very appreciative if you can turn on your cameras during your presentations. So with these, just going real quick, this is not working. I don't know what's happening, but I cannot. Okay, here it is. To our agenda, we're really very appreciative to have Frederick Hamelin from Health Canada talking on the approval process on ISO 13485 at the agency. We also have Eamon Huxley from to talk and help us navigating through the approach of the auditing organizations to ISO 13485. And with these, we just want to remark that this is an event that we have organized based on the project that we're running with COFEPRIS, the Medical Device Regulatory Convergence COVID-19 project, sorry, that this is a joint effort with USAID and the Coalition, of course, with COFEPRIS. And we are very appreciative of all the support that we have had through this project from several different subject matter experts. So with this, I'll pass it to Carlos Garnica, that is Deputy Director of the International Affairs Department at COFEPRIS, for his opening remarks. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Sandra. Muy buenos días a todos. Permítanme presentarme.
So thank you, Sandra. Good morning, everybody. I just want to introduce myself. I am Carlos Garnica Vergara. I am the Deputy Director of International Affairs Against Sanitary Risks at COFEPRIS, and I want to welcome all of you to this workshop on the certification of ISO 13485. COFEPRIS, together with all the standards, are participating in this with the Medical Convergence Project. This project and the workshop that we're going to have today wants to promote international standards as a good regulatory practice for the support of technical aspects, as well as to have a better management in the decision-making process and all the processes that have to do with sanitary authorities regarding medical devices. This tool would also provide a huge amount of input that could be applied to the evaluation of the management systems, but specifically, it's going to provide more trust and transparency of all the procedures for all the agents that are involved and the results of the audits following ISO 13485. For this, we will have two blocks. One, to present the perspective of the regulator based on the experience of Health Canada, and we thank you for your participation here. And then we're going to have a second part where we're going to have an auditor, and that has been represented by the certification company that's called TECRA, and where they're going to present their vision. This webinar is one of the priority topics for this federal commission, and I know that this is also a topic of great interest of all the different entities that join us today, because it's a common context based on the different binding commercial agreements, trade agreements that we have negotiated throughout the world. So that is why we add this to the initiatives to optimize the authorization process and to have the best regulatory movement with the best international standards. This would also be seen in a better operation and a more efficient operation of all of our institutions, reducing all the technical obstacles for trade and improving the health of our patients. But it's also relevant for the regulated sector because all the productive chains are the ones that are subject to comply with all of these regulations and to have good performance, to have the best quality, security, and efficiency of the products that the patient will be receive, and that will make a huge difference in the market, where globalization means that we have to be much more competitive every day. So I only want to highlight the importance in the relationship that we have between the regulated sector and the regulators, as well as to thank you for your attendance and to wish you the best of luck on this event, because you can rest assured that by your active participation, we're going to have good results. So without further ado, I will pass the floor now to my colleague, Edgardo Arenas, so that he can start with moderating the first block and introducing our first presenter. Thank you, everybody, and hopefully this is a very successful workshop. Thank you. So hello, Carlos, and when your words gave us a good context of what are the general objectives that we want to achieve with this workshop. So once said that, I want to introduce our main speaker now to talk about the focus of the regulator regarding the ISO 13485. Frederick Hamling is a manager of the quality systems area in the Direction of Medical Devices for Health Canada, and he's been there since 2002. In his experience, in this subject matter, he's been the president of the group to develop the CCA Z285, which is the standard of the Canadian standardization organization that is related to ISO 13485. He also participated in the ISO 13485-216 development, which is what we're going to present there. And he was a member of Group Study 4. Also, this is to create all the audit regulatory aspects of the quality systems for medical devices of the currently known as the International Forum of Regulators for Medical Devices. He's currently an expert advisor and manager in the Canadian aspect of the assessment program and the unique audit program of the MDSAP. That is why Frederick is highly qualified as a reference and as the main person to present this module, as well as one of the main experts of the entity he just presents. So I just want to give a small preamble of Health Canada. Health Canada had a good transition in all the changes of medical devices standardization. Together with his standardization system, the previous system that they had that was known as CMS, they accepted the criteria of everything related to ISO. They were working also together with the pilots of the MDSAP that starting in 2014, 2016. And when those finished, the Canadian government announced the intention of implementing the MDSAP nationwide. They started locally together with the evolution of ISO 485-2003 to get to the latest version, that's the 2016 version. After a 4-year period of transition, it was the first entity worldwide to migrate to the MDSAP scheme. To date, all the manufacturers for medical devices in Canada must follow this program. But we also need to remember that the MDSAP is a mechanism based on ISO 13485 that has been supplemented with additional requirements established by the United States, Japan, Australia, Brazil, and of course, Canada. And this is as a result of all the work that has been assigned by the MDRF. So based on that, the success experience that we can consider from other entities and what they could share, or as others have invited us to see the scenario like what happened with COVID-19. With that, all the sanitary entities recognize the importance of improve these mechanisms so that we can face this issue of not being able to do the audits through the pandemic. And so this is why we had to establish reliance measures that will help us not only during an emergency, but also would allow us to respond to the limited availability of resources and preventing any doubling of effort. efforts, taking advantage of all the regulatory aspects. So without further ado, I will pass the floor to our expert, Frederick, so that he can clarify and talk about all of our concerns regarding ISO 13485 and their uses. Go ahead, Frederick.
So thank you so much, Edgardo, for the excellent introduction. I feel kind of special now. Thank you. I'll start by sharing my screen with everyone. Here we go. So first of all, good morning to everyone. I see we have quite a few participants from across the Western Hemisphere. Very much appreciate you taking time today to learn a bit about our experience. Apologies. Apologies. I was having issues with my power on my computer. Hopefully I don't lose power. This is embarrassing. All right. Okay. Anyhow, I'll move along. I should be fine. Yeah, as I was saying, it's great to see so many interested regulators from across the Western Hemisphere. I think this is a great opportunity. As we discussed prior to this meeting, the speakers, we're seeing a lot more of moving of manufacturing facilities away from places like Asia, moving towards more the Western Hemisphere in this sort of nearshoring exercise to shorten supply lines. And I think we're in a unique position today to work towards a harmonization, convergence, and reliance as part of this effort of nearshoring, which I think can benefit both industry and regulators as well as we work together to improve the oversight of medical devices. So just a quick little overview of what I'll be speaking of today. Very briefly, I'll speak about how ISO 1345 works with our regulation, or how it comes into our regulations. It might be a bit different than what some of you are doing in terms of GMP. And so I think it'll be important to understand some of these subtleties. I'll then talk a bit about our past experience in doing this and using 1345. As Edgardo mentioned, we used to have an old system called the Canadian Medical Device Conformity Assessment, or CMDCAS, some of you which may be familiar with. It did have some challenges in some areas that needed some improvement. And as we worked on that, we moved into MDSAP with our international partners. And I'll speak a bit about how we do MDSAP, what's our involvement, how we use it, and the mechanics of how, as a regulator, we can do this. If I have time afterwards, I'll try to just briefly touch on our experience with COVID-19. I didn't put this in my presentation, but listening to Edgardo speak, I think it might be of interest to some of you, sort of what our experience has been with the COVID-19 pandemic, the impact that has had on the oversight of medical devices, as well as supply chains in terms of gearing up supply chains to access PPE or testing devices and whatnot. So again, I think there might be some useful insight for some of you. And again, if I have a chance, I'll bring it up. So first item is to speak a bit about 1345 and the Canadian regulations, and how does that all work together. So to begin with, we need to understand that the way our regulatory framework is structured is we have the Food and Drugs Act, which is a federal law. So this is voted on by representatives, and it does not have a lot of detail. It contains high-level requirements of a very general nature, like you have to sell devices that are safe and effective. You can't misrepresent the devices. The devices can't harm people, things of the sort. But more importantly, it provides the government the authority to create regulations. And so we have the medical device regulations. And this is what brings in, for instance, the requirements for quality management. And in particular, the medical device regulations require the licensing of medical devices of class 2, 3, and 4. So we have 4 classes of medical devices in Canada, from the lowest risks, which are class 1, to the highest risks, which are class 4. only classes 2 to 4 need registration. And the regulations cover both IVD devices as well as non-IVD devices. So we don't use a separate scheme as they would in Europe. We have one set of regulations for both types of products. In terms of the integration of 1345, the regulations explicitly call for ISO 1345. And so it's not a reference to good manufacturing practices or some other sub-regulations, as some countries have sort of internalized the requirements of 1345 into a national regulatory document. We've not gone this route. We've simply said, there's a standard 1345, you must apply it. And so what the regulations say is that the manufacturer has to supply a quality management system certificate to ISO 1345 to obtain a medical device license, to amend it, so to bring in changes, and also to maintain it. So they have to be renewed on an annual basis. And so manufacturer initially has to provide that 1345 certificate and make sure that it remains valid, so that if it expires, it is replaced with a renewed certificate on file. Now, we ask for a certificate, but we don't accept simply any 1345 certificate. We require a certificate that comes from a third-party auditing organization that is recognized by the minister, that we call registrars in the regulation. So if I speak of registrars, I really mean an auditing organization. The terms are equivalent. And the regulations do set fairly high-level criteria that allows us to recognize registrars. And the two main categories are that they apply, generally recognized auditing practices as defined by ISO, IEC. So this points to 17021, for instance. And the other criteria being that they have the right combination of knowledge, training, and experience in the design, manufacturing, and use of medical devices to be able to carry out this work properly. So those are the two high-level criteria. How we then transform that into an operational program is done, I guess, I don't want to say outside the regulations, but through, for instance, guidance and policy documents. So I'll speak a bit about where we started from implementing this, what our experience was. And then from there, we'll move into MDSAP and see where we've made improvements and why that was important. So originally, our regulations are fairly recent, I guess. They were originally drafted in 1998, so about 24 years ago. And that's when we first brought in quality management requirements into our regulatory framework. This didn't specifically come into force until 2003 for a number of different factors. When it did become applied, it was under a scheme we call the Quality Management, the Canadian Medical Device Conformity Assessment System, or what we would just refer to as CANCAS. And again, this was a requirement for a 1345 certification issued by bodies that are recognized by the government. The initial program, CANCAS, was leveraging an existing accreditation scheme operated by the Standards Council of Canada, or SCC, which is our national accreditation body here in Canada. So it's owned by the government, but it's sort of like I guess we call them crown agencies or something like that. So it's like a federal corporation, but it's not specifically the government. And so this whole program was designed around the idea that there was an existing voluntary conformity assessment system for instance, ISO 9001, ISO 14001, and so on. And so there already existed globally a scheme where you had accreditation bodies that applied a document called ISO-IEC 17011, which was rules for accrediting certification bodies. And they were part of they're part of a broader coalition called the International Accreditation Forum. And that's sort of a peer review scheme where they review each other and they sort of set rules and mandatory documents on how to address certain situations that aren't explicitly captured in, for instance, 17011. And so they apply 17021 to the auditing organization. So this is the rules that the auditing organizations have to follow within this voluntary system. And so they get oversight by these accreditation bodies. And so that's sort of the voluntary conformity assessment system. To this, we added our own requirements as a regulator. So we had these mandatory requirements, in particular, the medical device regulations. So we expected that these would be sort of brought into the standard and part of the audit of manufacturers. And we sort of described how this was being done with various policy and guidance documents. And when we combine this existing voluntary system and our mandatory requirements, what we ended up with was these registrars that were recognized by Health Canada, and they performed audits of manufacturers that were to ISO 13485, but under this CANCAS program. So to give you a bit of an idea, it's a bit of a complex relationship with four parties involved, but essentially Health Canada and the Standards Council of Canada had a memorandum of understanding, some MOU, that we would work together on this project or this program. And as part of this program, the SEC would accredit the registrars to audit to ISO 13485, and specifically for our CANCAS program. We would then, through this accreditation program and our participation as technical experts, recognize those registrars, which we could then audit and certify manufacturers who then had the appropriate documentation, in this case a certificate, to present to us to obtain their marketing authorization. So it created, as I said, a relationship with four different parties to try to manage the whole thing. It was successful, I think, keeping in mind that doing this allowed us to conduct a form of oversight, even if not ourselves directly, over thousands of manufacturers located globally, with a relatively small staff, because we didn't have to physically go out and audit, thousands of manufacturers everywhere. So from our perspective, it was extremely cost effective to do this. The other advantage was because it could be combined relatively easily with the auditing activities required, for instance, for marketing authorization in Europe. It was a lot easier, I think, for manufacturers, because now they didn't need some sort of separate audit or inspection for Canada. It could be rolled into one with the CE marking audit. So that was, I think, advantageous for both parties. That being said, there were some challenges along the way, as one we would expect. Some of these were a bit harder to overcome than others. And most of these, I think, we sort of tackled when we moved into MDSAP. So if we look at some of the challenges, as I mentioned earlier, the program was built on an existing accreditation scheme for voluntary quality management system certification, so the ISO 9001s and whatnot. The advantage of this was that there was already 90% of what we needed already existed. It was already in place. We didn't have to recreate the wheel. But it did bring a challenge, because this accreditation scheme, already having existed, had its own rules and procedures that were not under our control. There were things that we could change if they were problematic. what we found was that sometimes our intentions and what we would trying to achieve within our CAMCAS program wasn't always in line with broader accreditation approach or perspectives. And so we had to reconcile sort of these diverging views. Thankfully, there were not a lot of these cases or a lot of these areas, but they did exist. And this was problematic when it occurred. The other thing we needed to recognize is that because we were leveraging the work of an accreditation body, in this case, the Standards Council of Canada, but it could have been any other accreditation body, they have their own interest and objectives, right? They are operating a program to suit specific objectives, which may or may not align with those of us as a regulator. And while we did have a memorandum of understanding with them, they were not subservient to us. They did not respond to us. They were not we couldn't basically tell them exactly what to do. We could set the requirements within the confines of our program, but things that were sort of overlapping with that into other schemes was really outside our purview, which meant that, and also additionally, the accreditation bodies did have to sort of answer to the IAF, which is their peer review mechanism. And so sometimes, they needed to perform certain activities or do things a certain way because of those rules and that relationship with the IAF, which wasn't necessarily in line with what we wanted to do. And of course, because it was operated by this accreditation body, and we only acted as, technical experts or observers, we didn't really lead the on-the-ground work of the oversight of these organizations. And so there was the benefit of not having to recreate the wheel, but it also meant that we were very strongly limited in what we could and couldn't do. We had a very narrow scope of work. And so that could prove challenging. It was challenging, especially when we started to uncover over time some of the weak areas that we had to face. Some of these we could address through things like guidance and training, but it was a considerable amount of things that needed to be addressed, and would have essentially led to a recreation or a re-engineering of the whole program. So when we look at some of the weak areas that we've dealt with in the past, and again, these are things that we learned over that 10-year period of implementing CAMCAS. And in hindsight, we see these as being some weak areas. But at the time, because we hadn't done this, we didn't have that experience. We didn't know that this could become a problem down the road. I think this is great for you to be here and learn about this, because you don't have to necessarily repeat the mistakes that we did, or not necessarily mistakes, but maybe oversights that we did by learning from what we did. So some of the key things that were, weak areas, for instance, the existing schemes didn't have a lot of requirements for the competence of auditors. Yes, there were requirements. They were sort of high level, very vague requirements, and left a lot of it up to the auditing organization to determine what's appropriate level of competence to do these activities. And maybe 80% of the time, that's fine. But in our field of business, we deal with some very high-risk products and some very, very sick and vulnerable individuals, keeping in mind what our end goal is. And we need to ensure that we have the right people doing the work to protect these patients from negative outcomes. Another challenge, weak area within our renewal program is there was not a lot of structure to the audits. Those of you who are familiar with MDSAP will know that it's a very, very structured approach to performing audits. There's a certain sequence of things that have to be done and certain very specific tasks that have to be performed preferably in a specific order, and information flows between these tasks. We didn't have that in our previous program, which meant that how an audit occurred was sort of largely up to how the auditing organization felt it should, and also how the auditor thought it should occur. There was not this mandated structure, which led to a lot of variability between audits in terms of how broad they were and how deep and focused they were. You could see, one manufacturer having a very thorough audit and another one making a similar product having a less thorough audit, simply because of that variability. We also saw some variability in the duration of the audit. So some manufacturers would get a 3-day audit. Other manufacturers would get a 4.5-day audit. Well, obviously, you're going to have a more thorough and in-depth review in 4.5 days than you would 3. That's just, I think, self-evident. Another challenge we had was that the accreditation scheme is very focused on the process of auditing and certification. And there was not enough focus placed on the output of those processes. So whereas the accreditation was very, very concerned about how we do audits and how we do certifications, which is very important, there wasn't enough focus, and for us as a regulator, of how reliable is that audit? How reliable is that audit report? How reliable is that certificate? Because at the end of the day, we worry about the individual manufacturers and their quality, not necessarily the processes by which those determinations are made. Yes, that's important, but there has to be a focus on that output. We also found that our old program didn't have many enforcement tools to change behavior of auditing organizations where we ran into challenges. And there was a lack of notification requirements. So one of the features we have in MDSAP, which is very, very important as a regulator, is we get these preemptive notifications to let us know that there's a problem with a particular manufacturer. You might want to look into this. This did not exist under CAMCAS. And so we didn't have as much information to preemptively deal or to get ahead of potential post-market problems. And so that, again, was a weak area that needed to be addressed. Which, maybe a quick interlude before I jump fully into MDSAP. So around the same time as we were revisiting everything that we had done with CAMCAS, we also started working with some of our regulatory partners, for instance, the FDA, on a program which was called the Multi-Purpose Audit Program, where they would combine an FDA third-person inspection with a CAMCAS audit and do that all together. So we were experimenting with various regulatory partners globally on this type of scheme. And as we were identifying some of the challenges and weak areas and coming to the conclusion that we now had to sort of rebuild our system to address this. And because at the same time we had other partners that wanted to work with us, we said, hey, what if we put this aside and build something different that just involves us as regulators, which is what MDSAP is. I assume some of you or most of you are somewhat familiar, but to give you a bit of an idea of how the system works, if you remember the previous slide I showed you with the 4 entities with Health Canada and the SCC and AOs and manufacturers, you had 4 parties involved in the scheme. Now under MDSAP, we've brought that down to 3. So we have RAs, so the regulatory authorities. Yes, there's 5 of them right now, full members in MDSAP, and some associate members. But we act as one. So we don't necessarily act as 5 individual regulators in how we conduct our oversight and recognition. We all deal with our own perspective and come together to do that as a single entity, as a consortium. And so we, as a consortium, we assess and we recognize these AOs, and then we take regulatory decisions about manufacturers independently. So how we deal as regulators with a specific manufacturer can be different between the different regulatory authorities because we each have our own program and our own rules and objectives. But how we address the auditing organizations, that is as a single entity, how we do the assessment and recognition and oversight. So again, in the scheme, you have auditing organizations. So under CAMCAS, we call them registrars. Here we call them AOs. And their job is essentially to audit and certify manufacturers. Billy Joe is certainly, one of our next speakers, is certainly going to give you a lot more detail about what that involves. And it's certainly not just as simple as saying, well, we just audited certified manufacturers. There's actually a lot going on here. But importantly, the other thing they do is they share audit reports and certificates with the regulators, as well as other notifications. And then we have manufacturers as well that are part of this, I guess, program or scheme, who contract with an auditing organization for these MDSAP audits and certification, and then submit this information to regulators as part of marketing authorization requests as appropriate. Some regulators require a report. Some regulators require a certificate. Other regulators preemptively pull the report and then make a determination based on the review of that report, whether or not they need to inspect that manufacturer. So there's different approaches to this. This is a very, very complex, I guess you would say, chart, which gives just a quick overview of how we conduct the oversight of auditing organizations in order to recognize them. So there's an assessment program for auditing organizations, and it's a multi-step. So there's an initial portion of it where an auditing organization would apply for recognition in the MDSAP program. So there are some forms they need to submit, including very detailed documentation. They need to attach a lot of their documentation, evidence of competence of auditors and whatnot in this application. That gets sent into the consortium. There's an application review to make sure everything's in order. Then we proceed into a two-stage assessment. So a documentation review to make sure that the documentation is in order. And then we do an actual on-site assessment, the last few years remotely, but an on-site assessment of the auditing organization to go through all their operations on how they operate on the business side of things, and to look at the records of competence, the records of how they perform audits and so on. Once that's successful, we then witness them 3 times. So we go with them and witness them performing audits of manufacturers 3 times. We may also perform assessments of critical locations if necessary. So a critical location would be like a secondary office, but it's not just any secondary office. It's those that carry out certain specific activities that are higher risk. So defining, evaluating the competence of auditors or making certification decisions. Some of the higher risk, I guess you would say, like the decision points. If those are occurring at these offices, secondary offices, we would call them critical locations, and we will visit them to make sure everything is in order. Once all that is done, the whole file goes through a process we call the Technical Review and Recognition Committee, Recommendation Committee, sorry, or TRRC. And at which point we, as regulatory authorities, do a technical review of this and base our decision to whether recognize or not, and any conditions we want to place on that based on the outcome of this review. And the final decision is made by a regulatory authority council. We'll see a bit about that in a minute. We then perform surveillance assessments every year following that. So once a year, they will receive an office assessment. Not quite as long as the initial stage 2, but still we go in and we check most activities and processes within the organization to make sure that they're continuing to operate in the way that we would want them to in the MDSAP program. And we also perform at least 1 witnessed audit per year. So again, observing them perform an audit to gain confidence in their ability to do so. We'll also work into this witness audits of audits that are sort of scheduled or controlled out of the critical locations as necessary. And so there will be the initial assessment and then 3 surveillance assessments. So 3 years of surveillance assessments. And then following that, we get into what we call re-recognition. So it's a cycle that repeats itself. So when we get to re-recognition, then we repeat. We redo the stage 1, mostly to look at any sort of changes in the documentation. We go back and do a stage 2 or re-recognition on-site assessment. But in this case, we would only do 1 witness audit in a re-recognition as opposed to 3 in the initial. And so this cycle goes on and on and on. And again, on the re-recognition, we do that technical review to make a decision. So how does Health Canada fit into and participate into this? So first off, we have membership on the RAC. So the RAC is the Regulatory Authority Council. This is the coordination and policy group within the MDSAP consortium. So for instance, my representatives on the RAC for Health Canada is the Director General of the Medical Devices Directorate and an individual from our international policy group. So these 2 people are responsible for the high level deciding type thing. Provision of subject matter experts. So we contribute to working groups. We have various working groups to deal with different parts of the program, whether it's updating some training material or updating our auditing guidance or particular procedures or forms or whatnot. So we contribute to that as subject matter experts, sometimes as a team leader, sometimes as just a team member, and we work with these other regulators. Each regulator, so Health Canada provides 1 APM or assessment program manager. So currently for Health Canada, it's me. I'm trying to divest myself of this, but basically it's the responsibility to manage and schedule the oversight activities for 3 to 4 auditing organizations within the program. So I'm responsible for, I think, 3 right now. It soon will be 4 auditing organizations, and it's my job to make sure that they have their assessments on site on an annual basis. So scheduling that, selecting the assessment team, making sure it gets performed, that the documentation gets followed, and so on, as well as the witness audits. So each regulatory authority manages 3 to 4, and that way we share the work. The other thing we do is we act on the TRRC, so the Technical Review and Recognition Recommendation Committee, pardon me, which essentially reviews files of auditing organizations to make a recommendation for decision and provide that recommendation to the RAC. The other thing we do obviously is the provision of assessors. So as a regulatory authority, we provide assessors and assessment team leaders to do both witness audits as well as office audits. And generally, these activities will be carried out by 2 regulatory authorities simultaneously. So it might be Health Canada and ANVISA, or DFDA and PMDA. So we always have 2 different countries involved. And finally, we provide, regulatory expertise. So there may be, technical questions that come up within the program about Canadian regulations and how they apply, or the interpretation of whether a finding is a nonconformity or not based on our regulations, or tailoring program requirements to meet our needs. So these are all the ways that we fit into MDSAP. And what do we get out of it? Well, there's 3 main components that come out of MDSAP that we would use. So there's the actual audit reports, the certificates, and something called 5-day notices and NGEs. And I'll just touch on that quickly. So a 5-day notice, so we have rules within the program that says that if following an audit, there are certain types or number of findings that are found or discovered, then the auditing organization has to alert the regulatory authorities within 5 days. So they very quickly notify us of this. So we get an early warning that there are problems. This is before the audit report is even prepared. It's just a heads up to say, hey, this particular company, we went in to audit it and the place was a disaster and we have concerns about product safety, for instance. So we get this 5-day notification, we can immediately work to it. We don't have to wait X number of days for the report to be prepared. NGEs is just an acronym for Nonconformity Grading and Exchange Form. So we use a standardized form that auditing organizations put nonconformities in and grade them. So we have an algorithm for assigning a score to findings. And so these forms are very useful for us because we can very quickly screen findings from an audit to find, how serious is it, what exactly it was affecting. And it's a great source of data for a broader oversight program where you're creating trigger points that would cause you to go and investigate a particular manufacturer if they have X amount of findings or findings related to specific clauses of 1345, which you're much more interested in because they present a higher risk. So we take these things and we concentrate that, if you will, into regulatory oversight. So how does that fit into our regulatory scheme? From a actual use of the output. So from a pre-market review perspective, generally we would use things like, we might review audit reports. So when we have questions or concerns about a particular product at the review stage for marketing authorization, we can access these reports, which allows us to gain some insight into how the manufacturer is operating, get some of the details of some of the problems and that they are experiencing when we have concerns at a pre-market review. We can also look at nonconformity grading exchange forms over a number of years. So we can go back 3 or 4 years and see how have they been performing or how have they been conforming to requirements over the last 2-3 years to give us an idea of, the general level of conformity of this manufacturer. We can also use something, REPS data. So REPS is an online tool or portal that's operated by MDSAP. It's currently offline, but it's supposed to be back online soon. And it's an online portal that the auditing organizations upload their data into and their reports and whatnot. So we can use this data to find, for instance, relationships between different facilities. And then we can look into the history of these facilities and the compliance of these facilities. So when we look at very complex products, this type of information helps us, provides us insight for this review. From that pre-market review to licensing. So as I'd mentioned previously, as part of our licensing process, manufacturers submit a certificate, not an audit report. So we don't review audit reports as part of licensing. We rely on the certificate, which is why it's important for us to have a strong program and confidence in those auditing organizations. So we can then turn around and take this certificate and trust it at face value and say, yes, this certificate tells me that this company is complying and we can move forward with the marketing authorization. Sometimes we also make use of this REPS data. Again, confirming addresses or related facilities and things like that, which aren't always clear. And REPS is a useful tool for us because when we're dealing with manufacturers that are maybe in very far away time zones, it's hard for us to communicate effectively. So when we go back and look at that data and answer questions for ourselves, it speeds up the program, the process as well. From a post-market surveillance, then we have lots of different things we can use. So obviously the 5-day notice is a big one. So auditing organizations warning us that there's a problem with the manufacturer obviously is a big deal for 5-day, for post-market surveillance. And again, non-conformity grading and exchange forms, great tool for that. When we identify these problematic sort of manufacturers or these safety signals or quality signals, then we can go in and take these audit reports and read them more in depth, keeping in mind that they average 30 to 50 pages each, which is also why we don't review every single one. We have over 3,000 manufacturers having an audit every year. with a report of 30, 50 pages, I think we'd have to be each reading a few hundred pages every day of audit reports to do this. We don't have the staff to do that, and I don't think the benefit is there. And finally, when we need to do investigations into specific problems or complaints or challenges in the marketplace, then again, we can access those reports, we can access those NGEs. It provides us a lot of useful information and insight into what's going on that we otherwise would not have. And it leverages a program which doesn't require us to use huge amounts of resources and money to achieve this. So what is the outcome of all this? What is the benefits to that? Well, for us as a regulator, this allows for work sharing with our regulatory partners, which is a really big deal. Governments everywhere are always sort of feeling the pressure on their budget and their staffing, and having people review lots of material or travel to a lot of places to do audits is expensive. It consumes a lot of resources. And if we can share common work with our regulatory partners with which we are aligned, then we all benefit from pooling our resources. It also creates a very effective platform for harmonization, convergence, and reliance. Yes, these are very important topics globally as regulators and for industry, but they don't always necessarily happen sort of organically or randomly. They need to have a proper environment or platform to do this in. And we have found that MDSAP has been a very good platform for us to work together, to adapt each other, make things work together, harmonize, in some cases converge our regulations toward the same requirements, and also to learn to rely on these other regulators that we partner with on their decisions and outcomes. And when we put all that together, what that means is that as a individual regulatory authority that's using this broader program in which we have input and participate, is we can have confidence in those outcomes, which means that when we receive that MDSAP certificate with license application, and we go through that certificate and make sure it's proper and correct and valid, and it is to the right manufacturer and covers the right products, we can have confidence that the oversight was done the way we want it to, and we can move on with our core business of that pre-market evaluation and more of the marketing authorization administrative aspect. I do have a question period to answer now. I can also briefly speak to our experience with COVID-19 and the ramping up of supply issues. I guess maybe Edgardo might have an opinion on which he would prefer me to do, but I will, I think, work or answer some of these.
Muchas gracias, Fred. Sí, muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Frederick. Yes, we have 15 minutes now for a Q&A for everything you have shared with us. First of all, we have a question by Natalie Trejos, and perhaps, I don't know if this is the right time to answer that question, or maybe we should wait, because it's speaking about the equivalence of the registrars, the ISO organizations. Would they be equivalent to the European Union notifiers? This is a question that better be answered by email later today, I think. So we're going to skip this one.
Well, and actually, I might actually be able to answer that. Sorry,
adelante.
So
yes, please go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah. So for the first question, are registrars in Canada the equivalent to notified bodies in EU? This is something we've talked about, for 20 years. The answer is both yes and no. So in some cases, they are the same bodies. We recognize auditing organizations or registrars that are in fact notified bodies. So for instance, DQS Med in Germany is recognized by us, but is also an EU notified body. In other cases, the answer is no, but not entirely. So for instance, if you think of, for instance, BSI or TÜV Süd, which are two of the biggest players in this industry in terms of number of registrations. the offices that we recognize are not themselves notified bodies, but they are part of a broader company, which includes offices that are notified bodies. So we work with TÜV Süd in the US versus the fact that TÜV Süd in Munich is a notified body. The reality is that, yes, they're separate offices, but they are all the same company. They share resources. And in fact, they can offer the combined services through a single point. So they're not necessarily always the same, but they're very similar. And in terms of the equivalency in the scope of work, there's a lot of similarity. However, in the EU, the notified bodies are performing pre-market review, so the product evaluation for safety and effectiveness. Under MDSAP and under our scheme, that is done by the regulators. So we maintain that decision ability and we rely on the quality portion only. So that's a bit of a difference.
Tenemos una pregunta más.
There is another question by Juliet from Colombia, and it's about the time that it took Health Canada to make the transition between ISO and MDSAP. How long did it take? I think you spoke of something like that, 4 to 6 years for MDSAP for some people, but you have more accurate data about your own case.
Yes, thank you. It was a challenging transition. Initially, we announced this in late 2015 that it was our intention to go from our CAMCAS program to MDSAP. And we wanted to take 3 years to do this. The reason we said 3 years was because 3 years is the normal life cycle of the quality management system certificate. So the idea is if everyone starts right away when we announce, that everyone can organically flip to MDSAP when they renew their certifications. That was our idea. We did have to end up extending this at least by 1 year because we were faced with some challenges. In particular, when we first started, 1345 was still in the 2003 version, and then it became 2016 version, which meant that we had to account for a lot of the changes that were coming into play and the ability for manufacturers and auditing organizations to adapt to that and make those transitions. The other factor that came in to sort of modify our plans a bit include the transition in the European Union from the Medical Device Directive, the Active Implantable Medical Device Directive, the IVD Directive, to their new EU MDR and EU IVDR. And so that also created, in parallel, a very large transition for a lot of manufacturers. And so now we were expecting manufacturers to deal with transition to MDSAP, transition to new version of 1345, for many of them, new European regulations. It was a lot for them to do. And so because of that, we prolonged it by a year because it was a challenging situation. Keep in mind also at the same time, this is when Brexit was happening and being decided, and there was a lot of concern in the industry that there could be problems down the road if notified bodies based in the UK were no longer recognized by the EU and what it would mean. And so you had, auditing organizations try to open new offices and manufacturers going from one auditing organization to another. The whole thing was very, very challenging for everyone involved. And because of that, we did prolong that. So we gave it a 4th year. The other thing we did, again, to help facilitate the transition is that we allowed manufacturers to be very flexible in their approach to sort of say, well, I'm not going to start initially with a new MDSAP certification. So I will start midway through an existing process of doing MDSAP through the surveillance until I get to the recertification and then the certificate, which added a few years in effective transition, in the sense that we didn't have on file a certificate, but an MDSAP certificate for every manufacturer until last year, because of that extension of those surveillance transition. but everyone had to be on record with either a certificate or having their audits performed and records on hand with us by the end of 2019. It's just that rolling out those certificates took a bit longer.
Muy bien. Tenemos una más de Sheila Pérez que nos
We
pregunta.
have another one from Sheila Perez, who's asking, what is the 5-day notices in the post-market surveillance about? What does that refer to?
Thank you, Sheila. It's an excellent question. 5-day notices are both really great, but we also hate receiving them. So in MDSAP, we have a rule that basically says, if during an audit, there are more than 2 grade 4 findings, or at least 1 grade 5 finding. And when I say grade 4 or 5, so we have rules for grading nonconformities. So they either start out as a 1 or a 3, depending on whether it has direct impact on the product or not. And then to this, we add escalation factors like, is this something that's recurring? Has this happened before in the last few years? Does this lead to the release of non-conforming product? Things like that. So using those rules, we set a score of 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. If there's more than 2 grade 4s or at least 1 grade 5 finding, so the highest severity, then the auditing organization has, within 5 days of the end of the audit, they have to send us this 5-day notice, which basically says, hey, we met this threshold. Here's our non-conformity grading exchange form for this manufacturer. So we very early get notification of these problems. It's a great tool, but we don't like receiving them because it's basically bad news. No one likes to receive bad news. So when we receive that, I have someone on my team who basically goes to them and say, is this a manufacturer selling in Canada? Is this concerning products that they sell in Canada or concerning regulatory requirements specific to Canada? And so they'll sort of evaluate the risk level of that. And when there's a concern and says, yes, we would be impacted by this finding, we can then take action. We can have our post-market group do a risk hazard analysis. We can have our enforcement group take enforcement actions with the manufacturer. Before that, we often pull the reports and start going through the history of the manufacturer and getting as much information. So on the post-market side, that 5-day notice is just a very quick notification to us that there's a problem. It's not perfect. It doesn't often have all the information you want, but it's a prompt to take action when it's necessary.
Muchas gracias. De México, Janet.
Thank you. From Mexico, we have Janet that is asking, she has some questions. If you publish those auditing companies that are recognized by Health Canada to certify the manufacturing management quality systems.
Yes. And so, yes, we do. Not very well, unfortunately. And let me explain. So initially under CAMCAS, we were the only party involved. We are the only ones that were doing the recognition. And so we had a list on our website that was available that listed them. Under MDSAP, because we are doing this with partners, there's a lot more going on. And because of that, the list updates fairly often, especially in terms of, the contact person or a specific address of an auditing organization if they've moved and whatnot. And so the MDSAP consortium has an official list of auditing organizations. And as Health Canada, we point to that. Obviously, we could reproduce that list. We don't, because then there's a risk that that list might be updated. It could be as simple as a change in address or contact person, and our list will be outdated, which it is now anyways, full disclosure. And part of that has to do a lot with some of the challenges we've had in keeping that list updated because of our IT policies. And obviously the last 2 years, with respect to the pandemic, we've basically been told, unless it's related to COVID, it's not changing on our website. So yes, we publish it. Right now we're pointing to the official list on the MDSAP Consortium website, which is hosted by the FDA, simply because they have the least restrictive rules for their website, and it's the most convenient thing. But yes, they are absolutely published. You just have to know where to look.
And I'm going to take advantage of this to say that additionally, there are some best regulatory practices, obligations that the WTO or the USMCA agreement require them, where we are promoting that there should be transparency in all regulatory actions. So to this regards, then the best thing would be to have it published. So we could consider that as part of our agencies, you know, like COFEPRIS, when we want to implement this type of recognition. I'm going to go to another question that is sent by Carlos Flores, and that is related to that. And then I will go back to the previous question. So Carlos is asking, what would be a viable option for those countries where auditing entities do not exist? You know, I understand that we have the private ones, but I would like to understand that.
So I'm going to make sure I understood the question correctly. So what about countries where there is no local auditing organization to perform those MDSAP audits? I wouldn't say that that's necessarily a problem. Auditing organizations have been operating globally for many, many years. So while their offices may not be located in every country, whether it's a local office or their head office, they do have a global reach in terms of many of them have auditors in every region of the world that are housed in every region of the world, so they can fairly quickly deploy to different countries. And if not, they can have auditors travel. Obviously, there are sometimes some limitations to this, one of which has to do sometimes with language. When you have very, very specific technical requirements. So you need a person that's very, very knowledgeable about a very specific thing. Like if you need an expert on, you know, aseptic processing and aseptic packaging practices. So maybe you need a medical microbiologist. Well, finding one that speaks every possible language is going to be a challenge. So sometimes obviously interpretation and translation comes into play. But generally, auditing organizations will be willing to go perform an audit pretty much anywhere except the war zone, or, you know, somewhere that's blatantly unsafe. But otherwise, they basically, everywhere in the world, they're willing to go and do those audits. So having a local body isn't a necessity at all.
Sí, además, creo que se puede señalar que con este fomento de que más
And
países
in addition, we could say that with the fact that more countries are being invited or want to join the MDSAP, this would also promote the fact that we could have authorized auditors that used to work with ISO and now are going to adapt to the MDSAP with the additional requirements. And we're going to have more, and they're going to be much more available. You know, the United States and Canada have a large number of auditors. In Mexico, we have some of them also. I'm sure that that number is going to double. In Brazil, we also have a huge amount of auditors, and those could help as the auditors for all the Americas. Now, our next question is Marisol Garcia from Mexico, asking about how do you harmonize the certification when the production lines are not the same for different countries?
Right. That's a good question. Sometimes it's not as problematic as we would think. So for instance, one of the big differences, for instance, when you look at products that have slightly different production lines, when you look at electromedical devices, where the power supply requirements between, say, Europe and North America or South or Central America might be different because we have different electrical grids. they're fundamentally the same product, but they'll have a different power module. Similarly, even if the product would be identical across the world, the labeling will be different depending on the jurisdiction. Obviously, there's going to be, local or national labeling requirements that will vary. There'll be language requirements as well that will vary. And also sometimes the marketing approach in different jurisdictions might slightly vary. But fundamentally, the product remains essentially the same. So I think there's two specific situations. The first situation being one where there are slight variations between products depending on where they're going, because the certification is more at a sort of like a product family level and not down to the model number. And specifically, we don't want to see things like model numbers called out because of these things often change or there might be errors. So if a company is making snare catheters, there might be slight variations between the way it's presented or like the colors or whatnot in one jurisdiction versus another, but it's the same product made essentially in the same way. So there's not a huge discrepancy between the two that it would impact the certificate. The other situation, and maybe this is more what you were pointing to, is a situation we would see where if we have a big global company like, I don't know, 3M, and 3M might make a product in North America, and they might make the same product in Europe, and they might make the same product in South America as well. It's a high demand product, and so they make it in different areas. And they'll have obviously different production lines, different facilities. And so the certification would be covering the different facilities. They would all be auditing. And we would expect that as part of their marketing authorization, they would have to disclose to us which facilities are producing this product, and we would verify that they are in fact covered by the certification. Even if the actual legal name and address of the manufacturer might be a specific facility, it might be an intra-company transfer from different factories. This happens, and it's not overly problematic. It just requires a bit of forethought of disclosure and keeping track of that. And it's a much bigger issue for higher risk products that require a lot of validations and controlled environments and things like septic processing and whatnot, where the manufacturing of it is very, very, I don't want to say delicate, but it's very important. The quality aspects are much higher risk versus some of the other products that are, I want to say, a bit more common with more common technology, where there's a bit less concern about different facilities manufacturing. But again, yes, we do keep track of that. And manufacturers do have to have some disclosure as to where the product is coming from.
Ok, muchas gracias, Fred. Dado que estamos empezando a rebasar el
So
tiempo,
thank you, Fred. I think we are almost out of time, so I'm going to ask one last question, but we're going to collect all of the remaining questions to send them to you at the end of the session so that we can send the answers. But the last one, we don't have a name for this. It was sent by an anonymous attendee, but they are basically asking, in the case of Canada, I mean, has Health Canada used the ISO 13485 and the audits of this ISO 13485 to oversight local distributors of medical devices or for local manufacturing sites? Have you used them? So this would be both locally or those that are sent abroad.
Right. So yes and no, or sorry, no and yes. So distributors, so companies that are purely distributors, they don't manufacture anything, they're only buying it and selling it. We don't have any quality system requirements for them. They do have an establishment licensing requirement, so they do have to obtain authorization. And as part of that, they do undergo an inspection by our enforcement, compliance and enforcement body. But they are not audited to 1345 because, I mean, the standard is really much more geared towards the design and manufacturers of devices and less towards the distribution. And so because there's a certain amount of effort and cost involved with that, we don't feel that it benefits to apply that to a distributor versus a manufacturer. And in terms of local manufacturers, absolutely. Manufacturers in Canada, which is about, I think, maybe 15% of our products are manufactured here. They have to comply to the same rules, including the same auditing requirements and licensing requirements as foreign manufacturers.
Ok, quizá yo tuve un problema con la interpretación, pero bueno, sí, refería también esto, que qué pasaba
I think I
cuando...
might have an issue with interpretation. What I wanted to know is what happens when the distributor or the manufacturer, the distributor does not have any facility in Canada. But I think that it was answered in the same way, right? I mean, the regulation applies for all.
Y bueno,
Correct.
como comenté, voy a tomar nota de las siguientes, de las preguntas que sigan llegando.
As I was saying, I'm going to take note of the questions that I'm getting here. And thank you for all your contributions and for everything. Thank you, Fred, for your participation in this